Story 1. The Watcher in the Cascades. The Pacific Northwest has always called to me. There's something about the dense forests, the perpetual mist, and the way sound carries differently through those ancient trees that makes you feel both connected to nature and utterly alone. I'd been planning this solo backpacking trip through the North Cascades for months, mapping out a 5-day route that would take me deep into some of the most remote wilderness Washington has to offer. I started the hike on a Thursday morning in late September, when the tourist crowds had thinned but the weather was still decent. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. I covered good ground, found perfect campsites, and even managed to spot a black bear fishing in a stream about 100 yards downstream from where I was filtering water. It kept its distance, I kept mine, and we both went about our business like civilized neighbors. But on the third night, something changed. I'd set up camp in a small clearing beside a creek, maybe 8 miles from the nearest trail marker. The spot was ideal, level ground, fresh water, and surrounded by towering Douglas firs that provided natural windbreaks. I'd pitched my tent, cooked dinner, and was settling in for the night when I first noticed the silence. Anyone who's spent time in deep wilderness knows that silence is relative. There's always something. Wind through branches, water over rocks, the distant call of an owl, or the scurry of small creatures in the underbrush. But this was different. This was the kind of absolute quiet that makes your ears ring, like someone had suddenly muted the entire forest. I unzipped my tent fly and peered out into the darkness. My headlamp cut through the black maybe 20 feet before being swallowed completely. I listened hard, straining to pick up any sound at all, but there was nothing. Even the creek seemed muffled. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 points of pale green light, maybe 7 feet off the ground, perfectly still, about 40 yards away at the edge of my light's reach. They weren't the bright reflective gleam you get from a deer or bear caught in a flashlight beam. These were different, dimmer, steadier, and they seemed to be looking directly at me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. I kept my light trained on them, but they didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react at all. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I called out, "Hey, hello, you okay out there?" My voice sounded strange in the dead air, flat and somehow smaller than it should have been. The eyes didn't respond. They just kept watching. I reached for my bear spray, more for comfort than because I thought it would help. Whatever was out there was too far away and too still to be a normal animal. The eyes were too high up to be a cougar, and bears don't typically stand motionless like that. Plus, there was something about their positioning, the width between them, that suggested a head much larger than any wildlife I was familiar with. After another few minutes of this staring contest, I made a decision. I grabbed my air horn from the bear safety kit and gave it 3 long blasts. The sound was deafening in the silence, echoing off the surrounding mountains like gunshots. Birds that I hadn't even realized were roosting nearby exploded from the trees in a panic of wings and startled cries. But the eyes didn't move. If anything, they seemed to lean forward slightly, as if my noise had made me more interesting, rather than driving whatever it was away. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I backed into my tent and zipped it shut, though I knew the thin nylon wouldn't provide any real protection if something wanted to get in. I sat there in the dark, listening to my heart hammer against my ribs, and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just two reflective trail markers I hadn't noticed during daylight. Maybe the elevation and isolation were playing tricks on my mind. But I knew that wasn't true. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not the four-legged padding of an animal, but the deliberate, measured stride of something walking upright. The steps were heavy, each one making a soft thud against the forest floor that I could feel as much as hear. They circled my camp slowly, staying just outside the range where my headlamp would be effective if I turned it on. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as whatever it was made a complete circuit around my tent. The footsteps were rhythmic, purposeful, and they paused occasionally, as if the thing was stopping to examine my gear, or maybe just to listen for signs of life inside the tent. When the footsteps finally faded into the distance, I thought it was over. I started to relax, telling myself that whatever it was had lost interest and moved on. I was wrong. Around 3 a.m., I heard my name. Not shouted or called out, but spoken in a conversational tone that somehow carried clearly through the tent walls. It was my name, pronounced correctly, said in a voice that was almost, but not quite human. There was something wrong with the cadence, like someone learning to speak by mimicking sounds they'd heard but didn't fully understand. "Marcus," it said again, and I realized with horror that the voice was coming from right outside my tent. I bit down on my fist to keep from making any noise. How could it know my name? I hadn't spoken it aloud since starting the hike. The only identification I carried was my driver's license buried in my pack, and even if something could read, how would it see that in the dark? The voice came again, this time from a different side of the tent. "Marcus, come out, Marcus." It was circling again, stopping every few steps to repeat my name in that same flat, emotionless tone. Each time it spoke, I could hear that it was getting the pronunciation slightly wrong, like it was working from an imperfect memory or translation. This continued for what felt like hours. The thing would walk around my tent, stop, say my name, and move on. Sometimes it would vary the phrasing, "Marcus, come out," or just "Marcus, Marcus, Marcus," repeated like a broken recording. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have dozed off from exhaustion because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the tent fabric. I lay still for several minutes, listening to the normal sounds of a forest waking up. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, the creek babbling over rocks. Whatever had visited me in the night was gone. I packed up camp faster than I'd ever broken down a campsite before. Every shadow between the trees looked suspicious. Every distant sound made me freeze and listen. But I made it back to the trailhead without any further encounters. It wasn't until I got home and was unpacking my gear that I found them. Muddy footprints pressed into the fabric of my tent's rainfly. The prints were massive, easily size 16 or larger, but they weren't quite the right shape for human feet. The toes were longer, more pointed, and there were only 4 of them visible in each print. I've been back to the Cascades since then, but never alone, and never to that particular area. I tell people it's because the terrain is too challenging for solo hiking, which is true enough. But the real reason is that sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still hear that voice calling my name in that too careful pronunciation. And I know that somewhere in those dark woods, something is still waiting for Marcus to come out. Story 2: The Bone Valley Incident. I should have listened to the park ranger who tried to talk me out of camping in the Bone Valley backcountry. She was persistent, almost desperate in her warnings about staying away from that particular section of Montana wilderness. But I was young, stubborn, and convinced that my years of military training had prepared me for anything the outdoors could throw at me. The valley got its name from the unusually large number of animal remains scattered throughout the area, mostly elk and deer bones bleached white by decades of sun and weather. The ranger explained that it was a natural phenomenon, a place where old or injured animals came to die, drawn by mineral deposits in the soil that helped ease their pain in their final days. It sounded peaceful, even beautiful in its own way. What she didn't mention were the other bones. I hiked in on a Friday afternoon in early October, planning a 3-day solo camping trip. The trail was well marked for the first 5 miles, then became increasingly faint as it wound deeper into the valley. By the time I reached my planned campsite, a flat area near a natural spring, I hadn't seen another human footprint in hours. The valley lived up to its name. Scattered throughout the grass were the remains of dozens of animals, from small rodents to massive elk. Most were old, sun-bleached, and partially buried by years of leaf fall, but some looked surprisingly recent. I counted at least 3 elk skeletons within 50 yards of my tent, their antlers still intact and their bones still holding traces of tissue. I set up camp as the sun was setting, pleased with my choice of location. The spring provided fresh water, there was plenty of deadwood for a fire, and the surrounding hills offered shelter from the wind. I cooked dinner, wrote in my journal, and settled in to enjoy the solitude. That's when I noticed the arrangement. At first, I thought I was seeing patterns where none existed, like finding faces in clouds. But as I walked around the camp with my flashlight, it became impossible to deny that many of the bone piles weren't random. They were arranged in rough circles, with smaller bones placed precisely between larger ones. The patterns were subtle enough that they might have been natural if you weren't looking for them, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. I spent the next hour examining the arrangements more closely. The circles varied in size from about 3 feet to nearly 20 feet across, and they seemed to be positioned at regular intervals throughout the valley. In the center of each circle was always a skull, sometimes deer, sometimes elk, occasionally something I couldn't identify. The largest circle was about 50 yards from my tent. In the fading light of my headlamp, I could see that its center skull was massive and elongated, with eye sockets that seemed too large and a jaw that extended further than any animal I'd ever encountered. When I knelt down to get a closer look, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tool marks. Deliberate cuts and scrapes on several of the bones, too precise and too purposeful to be the work of scavengers. Something with hands and intelligence had arranged these remains. I returned to my camp with considerably less enthusiasm for the trip. The valley no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a graveyard, or worse, like some kind of open-air shrine. I built up my fire larger than necessary and kept it burning bright throughout the evening. Around 11 p.m., I heard the singing. It started as a low humming, so quiet I initially thought it was wind moving through the trees. But there was no wind that night, and gradually the sound resolved into something that was unmistakably vocal. Multiple voices, actually, harmonizing in a way that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite human, but too complex and structured to be animal communication. It rose and fell with an almost hypnotic rhythm, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like words in a language I didn't recognize. I grabbed my rifle and moved closer to the fire, trying to pinpoint where the singing was coming from. It seemed to echo off the valley walls, making it impossible to determine the source. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from the hills above me, sometimes from the darkness beyond the bone circles, sometimes from directly behind my tent. The singing continued for over an hour, never getting closer, but never fading away either. I sat rigid by the fire, weapon across my knees, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The flames threw dancing shadows in all directions, making it impossible to distinguish between actual threats and tricks of the light. When the singing finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse. I strained my ears, listening for footsteps or voices or any indication of what might be moving around out there in the dark. But there was nothing, not even the normal night sounds of insects or small animals. I must have dozed off sometime after 2 a.m. because the next thing I knew, pale dawn light was filtering through the trees. I was still slumped against a log by the fire pit, rifle in my lap, neck stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. That's when I saw them. New bone arrangements had appeared during the night, much closer to my camp. 3 small circles, each no more than 6 feet across, positioned between my tent and the spring. The bones were fresh, so fresh that some still had tissue clinging to them, and they'd been arranged with mathematical precision. In the center of each circle was a human skull. I recognized the skulls immediately, though I tried to convince myself I was wrong. They were the 3 hikers who'd gone missing in this area 2 months earlier. The search and rescue operation had made national news, but no trace of them had ever been found. Until now. I broke camp in record time, throwing gear into my pack without bothering to organize it properly. I needed to get out of the valley and report what I'd found to the authorities. But as I started hiking back toward the main trail, I realized I wasn't alone. They were pacing me, staying just out of sight, but close enough that I could hear them moving through the trees. At least 3 of them, possibly more, maintaining a careful distance as I hiked. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, something tall and pale slipping between the tree trunks. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The escort continued for the entire hike out. They never got close enough for me to see them clearly, never made any threatening moves, but their presence was constant and unmistakable. It felt like they were ensuring I left rather than trying to stop me, as if they'd delivered their message and were now making sure I got out alive to tell others. I made it back to the ranger station in half the time it had taken me to hike in, driven by adrenaline and the constant sensation of being watched. When I reported what I'd found, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the area was swarming with law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and forensic specialists. They found the human remains exactly where I'd described them, along with evidence that there were more burial sites scattered throughout the valley. The bones showed signs of ritual arrangement and ceremonial treatment that investigators struggled to explain. The case remains officially unsolved, though several experts have theorized about cult activity or a serial killer with an unusual MO. But I know what I heard that night and what I felt watching me as I hiked out. The Bone Valley isn't just a place where animals go to die naturally. It's something much older and much more purposeful, a site where some intelligence has been conducting its own ceremonies for decades, possibly centuries. The valley was quietly closed to public access 6 months later, officially due to geological instability. But sometimes, on still nights when the wind is blowing from the right direction, locals say you can still hear the singing drifting down from those hills. And every few years, another hiker goes missing in the surrounding wilderness, leaving no trace except for fresh bones that eventually find their way into new arrangements in clearings no human has ever mapped. Story 3. The Mirror Lake Entity. Mirror Lake earned its name honestly. On calm days, the water was so still and clear that it perfectly reflected the surrounding forest, creating the illusion that you were looking down into another world. Located deep in the Adirondacks, it required a 6-mile hike through increasingly dense wilderness to reach, which kept most casual visitors away. For serious campers like myself, that isolation was exactly the appeal. I'd been planning this trip for months, specifically choosing late fall when the tourist season was over and the lake would be completely deserted. 3 days of solo camping, fishing, and photography in one of the most beautiful spots in upstate New York. I arrived at the trailhead on a crisp Thursday morning in early November, with frost still clinging to the leaves and my breath visible in the cold air. The hike in was spectacular. The fall colors were at their peak, turning the forest into a cathedral of gold and crimson. I took my time, stopping frequently to photograph particularly striking views and to simply enjoy the solitude. By late afternoon, I reached the small clearing on the lake's eastern shore where I planned to set up camp. Mirror Lake was every bit as beautiful as I'd hoped. The water was so calm it looked like polished glass, perfectly reflecting the surrounding hills and the few clouds drifting overhead. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of tiny waves against the shore and the distant call of a loon somewhere across the water. I set up my tent on a flat spot about 30 yards from the waterline, gathered firewood, and prepared for what I expected to be a perfect evening. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that were doubled by the lake's reflection, I felt that deep satisfaction that comes from being exactly where you want to be. The first sign that something was wrong came around 9 p.m. I was sitting by my fire, enjoying a cup of coffee and listening to the night sounds of the forest, when I noticed that the lake's surface had become absolutely still. Not just calm, completely motionless, like a sheet of black glass. Even on the stillest night, there's usually some small movement on a body of water that size, tiny ripples from wind or the movement of fish, but Mirror Lake had become perfectly, unnaturally static. I walked down to the shoreline to get a better look. The reflection was so perfect it was disorienting. I couldn't tell where the real forest ended and the reflected one began. It was like looking into a parallel world that existed just below the surface, identical to ours, but somehow fundamentally different. That's when I saw him. Standing among the reflected trees, about 50 yards from shore, was a figure that definitely wasn't present in the real forest above. I looked up to confirm. Nothing but empty space where the figure should have been. But in the reflection, he was clearly visible. Tall, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, perfectly motionless like everything else in that mirrored world. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things, but when I looked back, he was still there. Still standing among the reflected trees, now seeming to look directly at me. Even from a distance, I could see his eyes, pale spots in a face that was too long and too narrow to be quite human. I backed away from the water's edge, my heart starting to race. This had to be some kind of optical illusion, a trick of light and shadow that was creating the appearance of a figure that wasn't really there. But as I watched, the figure began to move. He walked through the reflected forest with slow, deliberate steps, passing between mirror images of trees, while the corresponding real trees above showed no movement at all. He was getting closer to the shoreline, and with each step, his reflection in the water became clearer and more detailed. His clothes were definitely from another era, a long coat that might have been from the 1800s, boots that came up to his knees, and what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. But his proportions were all wrong. His arms were too long, his legs too thin, and his head sat on his neck at an angle that would have been impossible for a normal person. When he reached the water's edge in the reflection, he stopped and looked directly up at me. I was frozen, unable to move or look away as those pale eyes met mine across the boundary between worlds. Then he smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. That broke the spell. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away from the lake. When I looked back from the safety of my campfire, the water was still perfectly calm, still perfectly reflective, but the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night feeding my fire and trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Isolation, darkness, and the strange perfection of the lake's reflection had combined to create a hallucination. It was the only rational explanation. But around 3 a.m., I heard splashing. Not the gentle lapping of small waves, but the distinct sound of something large moving through water. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the lake again, though every instinct told me to stay away. The beam of my light cut across the water's surface, and what I saw made me question my sanity. The lake was no longer perfectly still. Instead, it was moving, not with waves or ripples, but with a slow, rhythmic pulsing, as if something massive was breathing just beneath the surface. And there were more figures now. Dozens of them standing among the reflected forest, all wearing that same old-fashioned clothing, all with those same wrong proportions. They stood in perfect rows among the mirror trees, motionless except for the slow turning of their heads as they tracked my flashlight beam across the water. I ran. I didn't pack up camp, didn't worry about leaving gear behind, just grabbed my keys and started hiking back toward the trailhead by flashlight. The 6-mile trail that had been pleasant and scenic in daylight became a nightmare gauntlet of shadows and strange sounds. Every tree looked like it might be hiding one of those impossible figures. Every sound in the darkness might be footsteps following me. I made it back to my car just as the sun was rising, exhausted and shaking. I drove straight home without stopping and didn't return to collect my abandoned camping gear for 2 weeks. When I finally went back, accompanied by 2 friends for safety, we found my campsite exactly as I'd left it. But there was something new. A message written in the sand near the water's edge, spelled out in what looked like fish bones arranged in careful letters. "Come back soon." We packed up my gear and left immediately. I've never been back to Mirror Lake, and I never will be. But I've done some research since then, digging through old newspaper archives and local historical records. What I found didn't make me feel any better about the experience. Mirror Lake has a history. In 1887, a small settlement existed on its shores, about 20 families who had come to log the surrounding forest. The settlement vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty cabins and no trace of the residents. In 1923, a group of surveyors mapping the area reported seeing unusual reflections in the lake, but their report was dismissed as the result of fatigue and poor lighting. And every few years since then, there have been incidents. Campers who report seeing figures in the water's reflection, hikers who find messages written in stones or bones along the shoreline, people who camp at the lake and wake up to find their tents surrounded by wet footprints that don't match any known animal. Most people assume these are just campfire stories, local legends that grow with each retelling. But I know better. I know there's something under Mirror Lake, something that exists in that perfect reflection and occasionally reaches across the boundary into our world. Something that remembers the people who used to live on its shores and is always looking for new residents to join them in that underwater settlement. The lake is still there, still beautiful, still perfectly reflecting the world above. But now I know that reflections can be more than just images. They can be windows, doorways, and sometimes traps for the unwary who look too long into waters that were never meant to be so perfectly still.